Hi, everyone. Good evening. How's it going? Yay. Can everyone hear me okay? Excellent. Thank you so much for coming out tonight. My name is Janella Esparza. I'm a visual artist and head of education at the McNay. Before we begin, I'd like to take a moment to acknowledge the ancestral lands we reside on and do a brief land acknowledgement and acknowledge the ongoing stewardship and the struggle of indigenous communities to protect their cultural resources and their homelands. We acknowledge the San Antonio River as Yanaguana, spirit waters, and Pajalate as the source of life for the city. We acknowledge this place known as San Antonio as the traditional homeland of many Native American peoples who are called Cuauhtecan in Spanish records, but consist of 200 individual tribes, bands, and clans of Aboriginal people who continue to carry their traditions today. So thank you so much for being here tonight and engaging with these important dialogues and discussions surrounding cultural identities and artistic processes. This lecture is made possible by the Louis A. and Francis B. Wagner Lecture Series and brought to you by a phenomenal museum team that I am very privileged to work with. After the Q&A, after the talk, there will be a Q&A session. And so if you have some questions towards the end of the talk, you can line up in the aisles on either side of the auditorium and line up at a microphone. And that's the best way to get you recorded, and you can voice your questions to our speakers. If you are, if it's not very easy to move around from your seat, you can raise your hand and a mic will be passed to you. So I'm very excited to introduce our special speakers tonight. Marcela Guerrero is the DeMartini Family Curator at the Whitney Museum of American Art in New York. Most recently, she co-curated with Angelica Arbeláez for the show Ilana Savdi, Radical Contradictions. Guerrero also curated No Existe un Mundo Bochoacan, Puerto Rican art in the wake of Hurricane Maria, and Martín Gutiérrez, Supremacy in 2022 and 2023. She was also part of the curatorial team that organized Vida Americana, Mexican Muralist Remake American Art, 1925 to 1945. That was in 2020. Guerrero's writing has appeared in several exhibition catalogs and art journals, such as CAA Reviews, Art Nexus, Caribbean in Transit, the Arts Journals, Gulf Coast, a Journal of Literature and Fine Arts, Interventions, International Journal of Postcolonial Studies, and Diálogo. Born and raised in Puerto Rico, Guerrero holds a PhD in art history from the University of Wisconsin-Madison. And also joined in conversation with Marcela is Mia Lopez, the inaugural Curator of Latinx Art at the McNay Art Museum. She has worked with artists and leading contemporary art institutions across the United States for over 15 years. Lopez was previously assistant curator at DePaul Art Museum in Chicago, and a curatorial fellow at the Walker Art Center in Minneapolis. Exhibitions she has contributed to include Remember Where You Are, Latinx American, and International Pop. Lopez is an alumnus of the Smithsonian Latino Museum Studies Program and the National Association of Latino Arts and Cultures Leadership Institute. She holds a BA in art history from Rice University and dual MAs in art history and arts administration from the School of the Art Institute of Chicago. It was very impressive. We're really excited to have them here. Please welcome Marcela and Mia.
Thank you so much for those introductions and for the warm welcome, everyone. And I mean that in more ways than one. My first few months in the McNay have been really wonderful. I'm so thrilled to be in conversation with my colleague and friend, Marcela, someone whose career I deeply admire, and I think it goes without saying, if you follow Latinx art at all, you have probably heard about the tremendous work she has been doing at the Whitney, and really groundbreaking for the field and also for museums and visual culture. And so I wanted to begin, introducing myself. Brand new to this museum, and also this is a brand new position. And I thought that it would be just important to kind of highlight why we are sitting here today. My position was actually made possible by a Leadership in Art Museums initiative, which is a consortium of philanthropic organizations, including the Ford Foundation, the Mellon Foundation, the Alice Walton Foundation, and Pilot House Philanthropy. And I mention that because really there's been a broader movement within museums in the United States to really think about diversity and to think about representation, both in terms of the art that's on view, the artists whose voices are part of the conversation, but also the people that are making these exhibitions, making these programs and publications happen. Curators like Marcela and I and other leaders that are working tirelessly to kind of improve the representation in the field. And so we're going to talk about our individual experiences and also kind of our observations from working in different institutions and also visiting with artists and hearing what they are doing in the field. I think that right now, we at the McNay, we talk about ourselves as an institution that is a place of belonging. And what that means for us is to really, again, think about the stories that we tell and how we are representing the community that we are a part of. Right now, we're at a moment when Latinx art has emerged as a force to be reckoned with. Arguably, that's always been the case here in San Antonio, Texas. But I think even nationally, we're starting to see even greater recognition for this as an important part of not just American art, but really art globally. So with all of that said, I'd like to ask Marcela to share with us a little bit about how her position came to be at the Whitney and how that was organized.
Yeah, well, buenas noches a todo el mundo. Thank you so much, the McNay, for having me and for this lovely invitation. So yeah, I always like to say that 2015, 2016 was kind of an important moment in my career, in my life, really, because it was a moment when two very important things happened. In 2015. Some of you might remember there was a study made by the Mellon Foundation, and it's interesting that your position and what I'm about to say involves foundations, and I think one maybe through line of this conversation is how much, sure, it's about our job as curators, but it's really about an ecosystem that enables and allows us really to be here and to have these opportunities to work with Latinx artists and art. But so yeah, in 2015 there was a Mellon study that showed the lack of diversity in the field of, in the curatorial ranks, specifically about Latinx curators. It showed that we were 3% only in the curatorial ranks. Which, I kind of knew it. You go, you're the one person in a department if you get a job. But to see it in such stark ways, in such obvious ways, it was a shock. It was a shock, I think, to everyone, to many museums. And they had to kind of reckon with this, not just Latinx art or curators, but in general, the crass lack of diversity was really obvious, and they couldn't kind of hide anymore. That next year, in 2016, another foundation, the Ford Foundation in this case, and Teresita Fernandez, an incredible Cuban-American artist from Miami, based in New York, she put together this symposium to really address specifically the lack of representation of Latinx curators and artists. And it was a one-day symposium. The director of the Whitney back then, Adam Weinberg, and Scott Rothkopf, who's now the director, used to be the chief curator until a month ago. went to the symposium because they had just opened the Carmen Herrera show, retrospective of the Cuban American painter. And so that was kind of the one show they had to talk about. And I say that they were very courageous to show up at this meeting full of Latinos. But yeah, I think they were the only like big museum in New York there that stayed for the whole symposium. But at that moment, Scott heard and Adam very loud and clear that they needed to do something about this, that they couldn't, also they had just moved to the new building by the High Line in the meatpacking district, that they had to do something. And at that time, I remember, maybe this is too much detail, but I'll just say the story.
That's good. It's a great story.
What happened? Oh, I had seen a job, in the career page of the Whitney, a job posting saying, we're looking for someone with 20th and 21st century experience in American art. And I said, this is not for me. Like, I'm not gonna pretend to be an expert on Pollock or Hopper. But then because I've done so many and our careers are very similar and we've done, I think, many of the same fellowships, the Latino Center, the Smithsonian Latino Center, I had done a fellowship with them. They send this email because once you do it, you're kind of in their system and you're part of the little Latinos mafia. They sent an email saying the Whitney's looking for someone with Latinx expertise, and I said, oh, that I can talk about. That I can, I can craft my cover letter. And so I got the position. Sorry, that was a long-winded.
No, that was, and to give some people a little bit of context, you were at the time finishing your work on the Radical Women exhibition, which was, you want to talk just a tiny bit about that?
Yeah, so something again, very similar, parallel in our lives is that in order to grow in our career, we've had to literally uproot our lives and move from city to city. In my case, that meant, after studying grad school in Wisconsin, I worked at the MFA in Houston. After that, at the Hammer Museum being a curatorial fellow for this exhibition, Radical Women. And that was, a position that fortunately wasn't gonna become a permanent position. So, we have to work, we have to, take care of our family. So I kind of, when I saw the job at the Whitney, I applied because, it's a Whitney, so you're not gonna say no to that.
Yeah. What I appreciate hearing too about, the Whitney kind of creating this role is that leadership sort of recognizing that there is this void, right? That they not only need to fill, but that it's possible to bring in, to bring somebody in, to do that work. And I'm wondering, what it was like when you first arrived there and were like, okay, you've created the position, here I am. What were some of the first things that you took on in that role? Because it's what was really incredible from the get-go, I remember I had interviewed with Scott, and he said, we're looking for someone who can address the gaps in the collection, can think about exhibitions, about Latinx art, but it doesn't, you can curate whatever you want. And I think a testament of that is my title. Even when I got there as assistant curator, it was assistant curator. It didn't have anything, and we are kind of it's one curatorial department, and we all have our little areas, not little, but our areas of expertise, but it doesn't mean that we're only in this niche and we only do that. So I appreciated that, and then when I started, I was working a lot with emerging artists. That was kind of, as an assistant curator, that they put me to work mainly with and to pitch ideas about emerging artists, to shepherd acquisitions of emerging artists.
but not exclusively. So that is something that I have appreciated about my role at the Whitney, and but at the end of the day, my kind of reason for being, I mean, that sounds super dramatic, but it is, there's so many Latinx artists to champion every day, that it's a privilege really to have this position. And that was kind of, from the first day, that was, kind of the North Star to be at the Whitney, was to do this type of work, which again, I am very privileged to be doing. And I as you're asking me this, and I'm reflecting on those years, that beginning, I imagine you are in a very similar place. So do you, and now, Mia and I are friends, so this is, you're kind of seeing a little behind the scenes, so back and forth to your questions. But I am now curious about you, and what do you think your, the role here is going to be like, what's exciting about, and what prompted you? I mean, it's incredible that you're here with your family, and that is such a big plus.
It's huge. My parents are here in the audience, and I've been coming to the McNay since I was a child. Being born and raised in San Antonio, I went away for school but came back regularly. My first full-time museum job was here in San Antonio at the former Museo Alameda. I was an educator there. And really, it was San Antonio that made me fall in love with arts and culture, and really understanding the way that arts and culture can really permeate beyond, a museum, but really into the heart of the city. And I saw through the work that I was doing at the Alameda, but also in spaces like the McNay, like Guadalupe Cultural Arts Center, like Blue Star, what happens when emerging artists are given opportunities, when Latino artists are, able to tell their stories, and to, communities can see themselves represented on the wall. I saw the cultural pride. I felt it myself growing up here. It was so cool to see artists that looked like me in this space. And then there was a disconnect when I went to college, where that was no longer really the case. You go into your art history 101 survey, right? Mm-hmm. And or even, I guess, 102 is what covers into the contemporary. Right. And it's like, oh, you're interested in Latino art? Have you heard of Frida Kahlo, Diego Rivera? I'm like, yes, I have heard of them, but is there anything that's post 1950 that we could talk about? And so that motivated me. I was supported by my professors both at Rice and at the School of the Art Institute, to study these gaps in art history. I was always encouraged, and yeah, there would be times when you'd realize that, wow, these exhibitions maybe didn't happen, or the ones that did weren't very well documented, and I became very excited about that type of art history. Mm-hmm. All of that to say, arriving to the McNay, I have been delighted to find that really the work that I'm doing is building off of a legacy of really 70 years of being engaged with Mexican artists, Mexican American artists. It's interesting because we all, Tejanos, we know that many of us didn't cross the border crossed us. And that's such an important adage for those of us that have long histories here. But also culturally, the border can often be so permeable, maybe not politically, but there is so often this exchange that happens. And so at the time when this museum was starting, there was so much more back and forth happening between Mexico and the United States in terms of artistic exchange. And and that wasn't limited just to Texas. We saw artists like Elizabeth Catlett, and many others who were actually going down to Mexico and studying with people like Rivera and many others. But I'm trying right now to kind of learn about that history, to learn what the McNay was doing. We also had an art school that was part of the San Antonio Art Institute that was folded into the McNay, eventually became the McNay Art Institute. And of course, there were, you know, Chicano, Mexican American, Mexican students there. I think that there's these through lines, you know, with that. The very first acquisition that was made by Mrs. McNay was a work by Diego Rivera. So I'm trying to look at that, and then the work that many of my colleagues have been doing really throughout their entire careers at the McNay, working with local artists, national artists, who are from many different backgrounds. A key idea for me that I think about every day is intersectionality. And so finding out that even though my position may not have existed, this work was being done in really meaningful ways. And so now that I'm here, what I'm doing is really bringing a new kind of focus to that, streamlining it, and really thinking how we can center Latinx art in a new way, while at the same time thinking about the McNay as a space really that can provide context for this kind of larger art history.
Yeah. I love what you said, and also, you know, to recognize that adding to this history, and what excites me about you being here is because I've always looked at San Antonio, and I want to recognize that Tomás Ibarra Frausto is in the public, and his scholarship was central and key, I think, to anyone who studies Latinx art, and to have you now continue that at an institutional level, it's so exciting for San Antonio, and you know, it's a kind of a mecca for me. Yeah, I'm not exaggerating, really. Yeah.
I love to hear that. Again, San Antonians were very, very proud people, so that makes my heart smile. And you know, what you speak to is I think currently a huge focus for me, but will always be a through line in this work, and I hope for this position going forward, is community engagement and recognizing that yes, we are a cultural center. You know, that there is such a deep, deep history of artists and arts organizations in the city, you know, and many of them have, you know, shown at the McNay in some capacity, artists that have worked here in different ways. I am wanting, again, to kind of think, how can we collaborate? How can we partner? What opportunities exist to kind of go into those institutional archives, you know, and revisit some of the, you know, the artist collectives, you know, that existed in the past, or you know, maybe artists that never really had an opportunity to showcase their work. So I'm thinking both past with the McNay's history and also the history of San Antonio, and really, in a way, thinking site-specifically about the work that I'm doing. I'm thinking about the present in terms of artists that are working today, regionally, nationally, internationally even. And then I'm thinking about the future in terms of acquisitions and stewardship, and how do we build a collection that is reflective of our current moment, and ensure that those kind of art historical gaps that we talk about, that those don't continue going forward. So at times it feels, yeah, a little bit overwhelming and daunting, but it's also the most exciting work that I could imagine doing.
I agree 100%.
Okay, so let's shift gears a little bit, because I want to ask you to maybe share some insights into some of the exhibitions that you have organized while at the Whitney. We've been having these slides in the background that have highlighted some of the incredible projects that you have done. And there's really an array of themes and so many different facets of Latinx art that you have touched upon.
Yeah. I'll touch on something you just said about kind of thinking the past, the present, the future, because again, I mean, the parallels are so many, and you know, when I started at the Whitney, right, it's what are the narratives that haven't been presented in this museum. I want to add to that discourse of American art that has for so many years, you know, neglected to tell the stories of Latino people in this country, but even to add them into the canon or the narratives of American art. So it is exactly what you're saying. It is the kind of the work at the exhibition level, at the collection level, and internally, right? Also at the institutional level of not just working in a silo and curating shows, bringing acquisitions, but how do you bring the entire museum to do this work in a thoughtful, caring way with even if you will, something that and again, I'm not the only one, right? We don't work in a vacuum. At the Whitney, one of my fiercest advocates and someone I work very closely with is Chris Scorza. She's a Mexican-American woman she's a director of education, and we've created a committee where we have people from many different departments and kind of trying to look at everything that we do from kind of a Latinx lens and kind of applying a framework so that we're all aligned in this work that we're doing. And to give a very specific example and kind of connecting it to your question about these different curatorial or exhibitions that you're looking at, I think the one that comes to mind, just because it closed 6 months ago or something. Also, it's kind of the biggest show that I've done, and I'm quite proud of, also because it's the most personal to me, was a Puerto Rico show. And that was, okay, so just to give a brief summary of that show, it's called No Existe un Mundo Post Huracán, Puerto Rican Art in the Wake of Hurricane Maria. It was a group show of 20 artists, including 11 of them live in Puerto Rico, the other 9 from the diaspora. That was very important. That had a reason, and that was that when the hurricane happened, it was a diaspora who were the first ones to respond in the absence of local government, federal government. They weren't there to help the people in Puerto Rico. And it was a show that the title is a verse from a poem by Raquel Salas Rivera, and I wanted to start with that, with kind of poetry, because something, and I think you might agree with me, when we talk about themes and topics that touch on the diverse communities, groups, demographics that represent this big umbrella of Latinx art, there's always, it's mirrored in so many stereotypes. And I think we know, because we work with artists, that their visual culture, what they add to the discourse, is nothing but stereotypes. And so I wanted to start with that verse, with that poetry, to kind of signal this is not an exhibition where you're gonna see representations of a hurricane, you're not gonna see destruction. This is, a group of people, a group of voices showing the beauty that's happening in the island, people struggling but also wrapping their heads, wrestling with the aftermath of the hurricane. And yeah, it was a great exhibition, very fulfilling in many ways. I think it was cathartic. It was the space of reflection that I think Puerto Ricans needed, again, in the absence of help from the government, from, acknowledging that Puerto Rico is a colony of the United States and putting that all on the table. I think that was quite important. I've also been thinking about exhibitions and working with artists and how artists can be our first audience. When you're, about to present, about to put out in the world this show, this huge exhibition, kind of being in close dialogue with the artists and, creating a partnership, really, because that's at the end of the day what it is. So yeah, that was an exhibition I'm quite proud of, connecting it back to, I'm quite proud of it because it also represented a show where we were all working together institutionally. So to give you an example, and even, Scott would acknowledge this, when they did the Carmen Herrera show, it was a beautiful show, but they didn't quite think about contacts in the press, journalists, they kind of let it be, but they didn't do the right connections to obviously the art forum, you know, that kind of those type of journalists, but connecting it to a Latinx, to the Latinx community. They didn't do that. So now when we're thinking about translations, which is something that we can talk a little bit more about, and kind of moving to translating the entire museum by, I think it's 2030, the goal that Chris has presented to management. But it also means, you know, in terms of the collection, we are about, and I think I'm putting it out there because I'm trying to manifest it, but we're very close to collecting all the artists who were in the show. So it's about 20. Wow. We're almost getting there. We're about at 18 now, but I think the other two, we're gonna complete them early next year, which is gonna be a precedent in the history of the Whitney of collecting all of the artists in a single show.
That's incredible. Congratulations.
Thank you.
What a great way to kind of indicate, you know, again, talking about history and stewardship, you know, that this was a landmark exhibition, because in so many ways it was. And I think too, you know, one of the things that you and I were, you know, sort of preparing to talk about was curatorial practice and sort of what our curatorial philosophies are. And I think we've obviously a lot of parallels and similar shared interests, but I love the approach that you talked about that was very, there's a sensitivity, there's a humanism to the way that you talked about working from poetry, which I read poetry all the time. I often go to poetry as a source of inspiration for the work that I'm doing. But that collaboration, and you went so far as to say partnership with with your artist, to have that translate into being able to make those acquisitions and to really kind of permanently say, you know, this work now belongs, you know, into this story of American art that we're telling at the Whitney. That's really powerful.
Yeah, I mean, I think there are so many ways of helping and being a resource for artists, and I think, you know, there were many complicated kind of installations, but the fact that they're in the museum and, you know, anyone can borrow, any institutions can borrow them when it was, anyway, I think I'm proud that these works are coming into the collection. But I'm also, you know, I want to stress that, and we've said it before, that we're not working in a vacuum. We're all really aware of what this network of other Latinx curators are doing around the country. And I remember, Mia, when you were at DePaul, that you started a Latinx initiative, and, you know, so many great projects that you did there. That has been kind of like, okay, what was Mia doing? What was happening? What are other curators doing around the country? What are those really key lessons that we can bring and see if they make sense to the Whitney?
Thank you for mentioning that. You know, following graduate school, I did a fellowship at the Walker Art Center, and then after that, I became assistant curator at DePaul Art Museum, a small university museum in Chicago. And one of the things that was really exciting when I joined that team was that we were all really inspired to address these gaps in the art historical canon. And I especially saw this opportunity to enhance the visibility of Latinx artists. Many of you may not be aware, but Chicago has a Latinx, predominantly Mexican, population of 1 million people, which is massive. And a lot of people don't know that because it's not necessarily always represented throughout kind of the major cultural institutions, even in kind of this sort of tourist Chicago, and like many, other cities, very segregated. And yet at the same time, Chicago has this incredible, the National Museum of Mexican Art is there, the Art Institute of Chicago, these important institutions. So for us, we created this Latinx initiative. I think it was my second year there that we started to talk about how we could with just the resources that we had, we did eventually apply for funding and get, the museum received Warhol funding for the project. But it was about, again, formally declaring this as a priority for the institution. It was really an opportunity for me within that role to start educating some of our board. One of the big differences I would say between the McNay and other institutions that I've been at was that here, really, across the institution, there is an awareness and appreciation for Latinx art. I mean, we're in San Antonio, Texas, but in Chicago, it's still considered, a little bit like, that's kind of niche. That's interesting. Like, it's not. How niche is it? Again, we're a city of 1 million Latinos. Like, let's open up our eyes, people. And it was, but everybody did, get on board. And the big project that came out of that first was this exhibition, Latinx American, that included a huge group of primarily emerging and mid-career artists that were based in Chicago. And then ongoing, since I have left, they've continued to really think about internally, scholarship that they are doing. They have a curator there who has a great focus on Latin American and Latinx art, but also they've been thinking about, engaging student workers and really the education component, which is such an important thread in the work that we do. Really thinking about, the next generation of scholars and people that are doing that work in the field. I feel so fortunate to have the network that I do because, since there weren't that many of us, we absolutely look out for each other. It's, colleagues like Marcela, but also we have some incredible, people that we can call mentors in the field. I think of Cesario Moreno, who's the visual arts director at the National Museum of Mexican Art, and loves to come to San Antonio. Similarly, says this is the place to go for Latino art in this country.
Yes.
Like, you are right, Cesario. So maybe we'll bring him in one day to talk. He's incredible. And also, thinking about people that were also the first, somebody like Carmen Ramos, who was the first Latina curator of Latino art at the Smithsonian American Art Museum, eventually became their chief curator, and is now the chief curator of the National Gallery of Art. And I was able to get to know her through some of the Smithsonian Latino Museum Studies program, and she said something to me that, many things that were incredibly poignant, but one that I think about all the time is how for so many of us that are advocating for Latino art, when we are doing, say, pitching an artist or an exhibition proposal, we don't have the luxury of being able to say, okay, everybody knows, pop art, everybody knows, pointillism, impressionism. We often have to start with a map. Say, this is where this person, was born, and this is what their culture is. And by the time you finish with all of the, biography, you've spent, already like 10 minutes, and then you have to kind of get to then getting to the work. And she gave us that as sort of, I think, perhaps to prepare this group of, emerging scholars to understand that there maybe is a little bit of an uphill battle at times. And granted, that was, I think now, almost 10 years ago that I first, heard her speak. I think that the field has changed quite a bit, and I think there is a much, much greater awareness. Marcela and I both really love pop culture, and we talk about music, and we talk about artists, and I think, it's interesting that I think for 3 years in a row, the #1 streaming artist on Spotify was Bad Bunny. Our country is changing. Yeah. Our culture is changing. Our institutions are changing. And so I'm excited by that, and I think that it only makes sense that, the way that we organize exhibitions, the way that we engage our audiences, the artists that we show are reflective of that shift.
Can I say something about the map?
Yes,
please. It's funny that you say that because when I was doing No Existe, at one point someone said, because, so many dates, right? Puerto Rico, 1493, then 1898, and then 1917. Like, why don't you start with a timeline? like, oh my goodness, you know, after you are done reading the timeline, the chronology, like you're what a turnoff. No offense if you've done a timeline of your exhibitions. But at one point I said, you know what? We never do that. Why are we going to do it for this exhibition?
Yes.
Why, you know, I am going to do this exhibition with the devices, I call them devices, that we operate with and that we work with all the time, meaning intro text, section text, extended labels, and tombstone formation. That's right. That's what we do for all the exhibitions. That's what we're going to do with this exhibition. And so, yeah, it's a little bit of Bad Bunny kind of energy attitude of like, no, we're going to do this way, and trust me, and it's going to be fine. And
yes, and I think too, you know, it's when we're talking about, you know, working with cultural form, with cultural practices and artists that maybe have not always been the focus of mainstream institutions. There's often kind of I don't want to say a fear, but there's like, how do we do this? That was, you know, definitely the case, I think, earlier in my career. And now, you know, again, obviously it's not so much, you know, an issue here at the McNay, but I think it's just been really refreshing to see how quickly the tide has, you know, changed. And also it seems to be perhaps a little bit more permanent than other moments where, you know, I think of like the multiculturalism of the 90s, and, you know, there was sort of a trendiness in the past to identity politics and representation, and that I feel like this is a very different, much more permanent, but also what's the word that I'm looking for? Authentic and
right, and I think the idea of it being more permanent is also tied to the word that you brought before, of belonging. And I think about it, you know, when I'm at the Whitney, and sure, I've done, you know, exhibitions that have kind of a Latinx focus or theme, and I think those are valid. You know, again, it's not bringing a stereotype or a cliche, but doing it with thought and care and nuance and complexity. But then and there are so many of these things that one can think of, but then the other goal is also integrating these works into these bigger narratives that we're pretending or telling at a place like the Whitney. It's a you know, if we're doing the work of bringing these works into the collection, let's have them in conversation with other quote unquote American artists from other diverse backgrounds.
That's something that I am so excited to continue to be doing at the McNay, because it's something it's why this was one of my favorite places to visit whenever I would be coming, you know, home from Chicago. You can walk through our galleries right now and see amazing, you know, juxtapositions of, you know, artists that are, you know, Latinx, artists that are more emerging, you know, right alongside, you know, some of, you know, the, you know, most established, you know, icons, you know, of modernism. And I think that, you know, this sort of the framework that the institutions, you know, provide is something that we can really kind of work with to, again, sort of emphasize the significance, but also I think gets that nuance of these stories. So I want to make sure that we have some time for Q&A. So I thought I would jump to what are you currently working on? What's next for you? Question.
So I had, I think 4 of those shows that you saw there I did them last year. No, 3 of them. But I was working on the 4th show that, anyway, it opens next November, and it's a show from the permanent collection. So it's my first time working with the permanent collection, which has, again, a similarity, 26,000 objects. I was looking that the McNay has about 22,000 objects, so I'm looking at them. So big collection is like playing in your closet. But and I kind of joke because really what we're trying to do with this permanent collection exhibition, I'm doing it with 2 other curators, is really showing and the new acquisitions that we've done. And I thought that an interesting kind of number that I would bring to our conversation today is, I mentioned that I've been very involved in bringing works by Latinx artists into the collection. And recently we were, Angelica, who works with me, we were giving a presentation and kind of looking, because this is part of my obsession, of, I know we started or the Whitney doesn't have the best record and has neglected for many, many decades art by Latinx artists, but I want to trace and I want to track our progress. It doesn't make us, at least to me, sense to complain and then not see how we're progressing or making a difference. Anyway, so we were looking at acquisitions of Latinx artists since the founding of the museum in 1930 to the present, and 56% of the works by Latinx artists that we have in the collection were acquired from 2015 to the present, okay? Almost 60%, 56%. We're talking about 8 years. And why do I say 2015? Because that's when we moved to the meatpacking district, to the new building, which kind of created the sea change really for the museum to be very thoughtful about these gaps that we had. And so it's really, that's why I'm excited to work on this permanent collection show, because all these works that started to come even before I got there, but more recently I really want to show them, and I'm very excited about this show. But what about you?
So
Tell
when does that exhibition open? I can't wait to see it.
November 2024.
Okay, fantastic. I'll put that on my calendar. So I am, like I previously mentioned, so I've been at the McNay a little over 2 months. And one of the things that I'm continuing to do is to really, learn the institution's history, digging through, the collection, and starting to see how that's an artist who, I'm not really familiar with. And they had a solo show at the McNay in 1978. I want to know more about that. What records exist for that. So I'm digging into that. I also have been fortunate, a few of the ideas that I've been most passionate about in my own art historical research have kind of been organically simmering for the last few years, and I'm trying to formulate, what next steps might look like for that. I'm interested really in everything from identity terminology, identity politics, going back all the way to the New Spain, Spanish colonial era into the present day. I'm also interested right now in Latinx feminisms and kind of thinking about archetypes that have existed through everything from kind of urban legends, thinking of like La Llorona, but also just kind of the nasty woman and the Madonna, and all of these kind of archetypes that we have are often put up against. So those just are a few of the seeds that I've been kind of trying to nurture. I've been getting out into the community a bit and starting to do studio visits, and I'm hoping to do a little bit of traveling in the coming year, and also to see what some of our colleagues are doing out in the field. An exhibition I'm excited hopefully to see later in the summer or fall would be the Chicano X body that some of our colleagues have organized, that's traveling to Miami. It's currently at the Cheech. So staying plugged in with what's happening in the field.
That's very exciting.
And then bringing that energy to San Antonio. So thank you so much. I think we're ready to open up for questions.
Okay. You mentioned about going trip to Chicago. I'm from Cleveland, Ohio myself. What was the biggest challenge from coming to San Antonio, Chicago, and traveling around?
So I would say, honestly, one of the biggest challenges was the climate. And I don't mean just the snow. I mean that like literally and figuratively. It was a little bit, it was a much larger city. I was used to a very warm and welcoming artistic community that I had, deep roots in. And so I was kind of reestablishing that network. And now it's funny, I actually, through graduate school, through my work there, I miss, the community that I had there. And I feel, if anything, now it's sort of a rebuilding moment, being back in San Antonio and reconnecting here. So it's always, you're kind of always growing and evolving. But I do not miss the snow. Other questions? Yeah.
Hi. So, for both of you, what are the challenges of representing an entire group of people? And what have you learned about yourself through your own work?
I'll take your question in a couple of different directions. I think a challenge in general of I guess Latinx art is the fact that in New York specifically, for so many years, these different groups have been ignored for so long that there's skepticism, and rightly so. Like, I totally understand it. And so it's a little bit of, wanting to, what Mia was saying, a little bit of creating the trust, of like establishing the trust. But to your point about different demographics, I think in our cultural sensitivity, in my case, I'll spare you the details. It's a long story, but my mom is from Argentina, my dad is from Ecuador. They met in Mississippi. They live in Puerto Rico since the mid-1970s. I was born there, I grew up there. I've also had these very circuitous sort of movement around the United States. It's different, spending time with Latinos in the Midwest than in New York or LA, where I've also lived. I think it's in part the learning and being thoughtful and educating yourself. When I was in Houston, I got to work at the ICAA, the International Center for the Arts of the Americas, reading all the documents that are in their archive, which was kind of its own, almost like a second master's degree in Latinx art. But I also would pose the point that, we don't ask that question, and I don't, your question is a good one, but we don't ask that question of Americanness. We don't ask them, like, what makes you an American if you're not, all of it, right? And so I always like to bring the parallels of, like, this is not so unique what we do, At the Whitney, starting thinking holistically and thinking about Latinx art is very similar, in fact, to what my colleague Chrissy Iles, who's the curator of film and video, did when she got to the museum. There was no collection of film and video, and she built it from zero. That's not any different from what I'm doing. So I just want to point out the parallels that exist, and that we perhaps are not asking those colleagues who are in more kind of white sort of fields, to respond.
I really appreciate your response in creating that parallel. I think something that I am so grateful to have experienced is the incredible diversity of the sort of Latinx umbrella. We are so not homogenous in many ways. These umbrella terms are actually are kind of ineffective just because there are so many different groups that fall under that. And as you spoke of, even within your own background, I would never endeavor to be able to represent that entire plethora of experiences. What I can represent is my experience as Mia, who's a fourth generation Tejana, who has lived in Chicago and Minneapolis. That's what I can speak to. And I can speak to the people that I've met and the stories that I've heard. I want to be culturally sensitive. I always am trying to learn and grow. I think that we all should be learning and growing every day. But I would never really try to say, oh, I'm representing all of that. I think that I do feel like there were points in my career and in my studies where that was sort of assumed of me, and that was a really heavy thing to carry, especially when you're a junior staff member, one of the lowest on the totem pole, and somehow also you're representing millions of people and their perspectives, and whoa, that's a heavy thing to carry. And so I'm grateful that that's really not the case. I hope for people that are in some of the positions that I previously held, and it's certainly not been the case here. I think, again, also working in an institution that does have diversity within the staff, that there is already kind of a sense of cultural sensitivity and awareness, and in the programs and in the discourse that we're having internally. I don't feel like I'm by any means the only representative of that, and that I think is actually allowing me to have more fruitful conversations, because I don't have to do what Carmen said in terms of, okay, pull out the map and let me explain. And I one time had a colleague at an institution many years ago say to me, just really casually on our way to lunch, one of these days you're going to have to explain that whole Chicano thing to me. Oh, and I was like, ooh, yes. I think somebody does need to explain that to you. I don't know what you mean, but so, yeah.
Hello, thank you very much, Mia and Marcela, for this thought-provoking conversation. The question that I have is maybe just a couple of ideas that you might have on the object of our conversation, which is, so my question is, who and what is American art, and where is it located, and what is its language?
Tomas, what an incredible question. Thank you so much. That's a dissertation.
Yeah. Who and what? Who
and what is American art, and where is it located?
Some thoughts. In the museum where I work, that has the name American Art, the curator, we don't like that term. We say that we cover art from and of the United States. So that is capacious enough for me to work with whomever I want, as long as, and which is also like not super uncomplicated. It's because we can talk about different Native American groups who don't recognize the border, the geopolitical borderlands of this country, or who their territory might overlap with what's called Canada by some people, or Mexico. So it's not. It's complicated, and we like to be there in that messiness. But when it comes to art, the types of artists that I work with are artists who are based in the United States, and then from that, whatever stories they want to tell. That's kind of going to your question, but.
I think because I'm not necessarily, tethered in the same way with the institution, having American art in the name, I feel like I've always liked the way that we have the concept of the Americas, the United States and all of Latin America. And I kind of sort of cheekily to myself thought, oh, well, maybe yes, I work with Latinx art. I'm thinking about American art, but really what I'm thinking about is the art of the Americas. So I think about that. I mean, I don't know, it is indigenous art, it is immigrant art, it is ephemeral, it's shape-shifting and fluid, and I think it can be so many things. I think as a category, it's probably dissolving right now in an interesting way. I think that it'll be interesting to see the way, maybe in 20 years, how our institutions like the Smithsonian or the National Gallery, how they start to organize that. I think that it's we're fortunate to be at the McNay to have the ability to be a little bit nimble in how we categorize and think. I mean, it's the way that we organize all of our galleries. We don't really break things down geographically that way. It's kind of thinking much more holistically and thematically. I think that American art is situated sort of globally now too, right? I mean, we're in the internet age. It's accessible. Art and museums are accessible anywhere, everywhere, 24/7, all the time. So I hope that what you were trying to get at was that sort of, that rhetoric of, these terms in a way have sort of lost some of their meaning, and that is at once really confusing and maybe frustrating, but also what an incredible opportunity for us to write new definitions.
Well, I want to thank you because I think I want to thank you very much for your insights, because I think perhaps the object of study of American art is something that is yet to be, it's in process. It's a processual thing, and we still cannot answer. You can answer in many, many different ways, as you both have tried to tell us what American art is and where it's located and what its language is. And so the language of America is being created by the artist of America, and where it is located and all those things are still open to debate. And so your conversations and your writings are going to help all of us understand that processual new idea of what we call America and American art.
Thank you, Tomas.
Thank you so much, Tomas.
I want to say one thing that what Tomas just said reminded me. I think it's important to think about the work of art that hasn't been made yet,
Yes.
or the artist that hasn't become an artist yet, and how we should be comfortable being in that flux and that uncertainty. We see specifically in the subject matter that we are talking about of Latinx art, how our demographics are changing daily and right now. So it's exciting to not be gatekeepy, right?
Definitely.
Because it's about inclusiveness anyway.
Yeah, the inclusivity, and then again going, this idea of sort of belonging, and how do we reach that person who doesn't even know that they're an artist yet, and bring them into the conversation. So. Well, if we don't have any other questions, I think we can wrap it up. Thank you so much, Marcela, for coming.
Thank you, Mia.